If you have a retirement plan, you got to know this one thing. Worried about your retirement? Not sure what's going to happen to your plan? Don't worry. I got a PhD for that. Now, I don't have it. I brought one in. What's up, Tom?
Good to be here.
I know you researched a lot on this. Like people have IRAs, 401ks, Roth IRAs, RRSPs, super annuitizations, depending on the country. But, you know, let's talk about like this notion of disinvesting and like people spend their whole world and time investing, not knowing how to create cash flow. Now it's retirement time. How do they actually get their money, protect that money? And where did this 4% rule come from?
Yeah, it's the common analogy people use is, you know, if you're planning to hike Mount Everest, you know, most people actually die on the way down because there's just as many risks involved, if not more risks on the way down. So in the same thing with the financial planning is we talk all about accumulation and getting to that golden date when you have enough money, you have met your number and you can say goodbye to the workforce and you've now hit financial independence. But it's so much more than just that number. In fact, I think I'm going to call it a cancer on the industry, but one of the things that the industry, the financial services industry, does a terrible job of on average, there's been some phenomenal advisors out there, but all they do is help you save, invest, and grow toward that number with no discussion of how the money comes out. And what's happening is there's this epidemic among retirees right now that are just hoarding capital, hoarding that wealth because they're terrified of what happens if they live too long, what happens if they require expensive ongoing medical care, what happens if the market crashes again, what happens if World War III breaks out, all the things that could happen during retirement. So they underspend their retirement and end up leaving massively taxable sums in their retirement plan to leave to the next generation. It's just terribly inefficient. It's not what the purpose of those plans were. So a lot of my research has gone into how do we give clients permission to spend? How do we allow them to, you know, pull spending power early into their retirement when they're in their 60s and 70s and healthy and able to travel the world and play golf and take their, you know, grandkids on vacations and all the things that are expensive and you want to do when you're healthy and able to do it. Whereas, you know, the other approach is just hoarding capital and maybe giving yourself a pay raise in your 80s, praying that you're healthy enough to even use it at that point. It's just not good planning.
So what's the solution and what do you recommend for them and what do you help people do?
So the solution's hard. It's always a case-by-case basis. Everyone's different, but the traditional, you know, mass affluent American financial portfolio is their primary residence and their 401k. And, you know, there are a lot of people have other stuff mixed in, but those are usually the two biggest assets. So if you show up at retirement with a big taxable volatile portfolio, you're going to be scared. You're going to have trouble spending that. And that's what people don't realize is they look at these projections in these financial planning software packages and you just compound your savings at 8% forever and it just looks like you can't lose. But timing is everything. So where a lot of my studies began, I can't believe I'm quoting this from 30 years ago now, but 30 years ago in 1994 was the seminal research by William Benjamin, which created what was called the 4% rule. And all he did was, you know, when rates were starting to get low enough where you couldn't just live off the interest anymore, you know, people in the 80s could actually just buy CDs at the bank, live off
like
the interest.
14%?
Yeah.
12? Yeah, right.
Just live off the interest and don't evade principal and you'll be fine forever. But once rates started getting lower and lower, that wasn't a viable option for
good
most
for
people.
Borrowers, bad for retirees.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So he did some research and said, okay, let's just hypothetically look at a stock bond portfolio going back 100 years. And hypothetically, let's say if you had retired on day one of 1926, for instance, is when his data set started, and then spent money for the next 30 years and inflated that income each year with actual inflation, what was the highest initial withdrawal rate you could have taken in that year such that the money would be spent the last dollar on the last day of 30 years down the road? So what was interesting about that was in 1926, I think it was 7%. 2 years later, it was 4.5%. 2 years after that, it was 7.5%. So it's all over the place. Like, and we have no idea what our next.
Like when you're starting, when you're taking the money.
We have no idea. So he did that over about 100 years' time, and 1966 was the worst case scenario. Where I think in his research, it was 4.15% was the initial starting rate. So if you had $1 million, you can spend $40,000. And you would have still had $1 left at the end of 30 years. So it created, and he didn't intend to, but it created what was called the 4% rule. Basically, this was the worst case scenario over the last 100 years. So as long as you live to that, you should be okay going forward. But that makes a big assumption that the next 100 years is identical to the last 100 years.
Right.
That does not have to happen, by the way.
Right. We don't know what's going to happen because artificial intelligence drove the market last year.
Yeah.
Right.
Just
Technology's disrupted the market massively. Companies have gone out of business. They're not even the S&P 500 anymore, and they've been replaced by more nimble companies.
Oh yeah, I mean the key economy today and your access to capital and the way that the financial markets work is entirely different than it was just 50 years ago. During that time. So to make that assumption is a big leap. But even if you're okay with that, that's pretty pathetic. On $1 million, you're a millionaire. You have $1 million.
$40,000 taxable.
That's
if it's coming from the retirement plan.
Less than $100 a day after tax. Like that's pathetic. So it really got me thinking, and that was the puzzle I wanted to help solve. And if the academics, if you read through some of the academic literature on this, they all call it what's called the annuity puzzle, because the most efficient form of spending capital is just to actually give all your money to an insurance company, and they'll guarantee you a paycheck for the rest of your life. And it's not 4%. Today it's like 7.5%. It's a real number. But people don't do it because they're afraid of, they lose access to their capital. They might not leave a legacy to the next generation. And they're just afraid to part with that and lock that in. So long story short is I started to dig into some of the data and what we can do about it. What can you actually do? You can't change market volatility. You can't change the fact that there may be periods of very high inflation. Those are the two things that drive that number the most. But you can build strategic assets into your portfolio so you don't have to sell low, or you don't have to.
Those down years, you're using it income smoothing, using it from another account.
Exactly. Yeah, they call it a volatility buffer strategy. Most commonly,
I like that. That's a good name for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of different names for it, and it's not just in the insurance world. The investment world has used this for years using cash, but I did a lot of research around that and what the impact of having that buffer asset would do for a portfolio.
Yeah, and if somehow people could just close their eyes for a minute and put themselves 20, 30 years into the future, if you're young enough, and think, all right, what do you want your life to be like? I can tell you what you don't want it to be like. You don't want to be opening, your phone the first thing in the morning and being like, what's going on in the market?
Right.
You're not looking at what interest rates are doing because I know people that have plenty of money, but they're watching CNBC far too much into the day to determine what their life looks like, and it's too unpredictable. So they might be worth millions. I just updated Killing Sacred Cows, and it was funny because there was a study in there that was just this simple. It was a story. I met this person, Intel executive, paid off multi-million-dollar home, and had a couple $1 million in a retirement plan, and was living like a pauper. Because they were just so worried, how long am I going to live? What are taxes going to be? And interest rates were really low at the time that they retired, so it wasn't kicking off much interest. So here they are, a multi-millionaire, living $50,000 a year.
Right.
I mean, that sucks.
Yeah, and it's happening everywhere, and it's happening. It's widespread. And and you think about the purpose of why you're deferring your money, why you're putting money into these retirement plans. The whole purpose of it is to spend in retirement. That's actually probably the worst place you can save dollars to leave a legacy to the next generation.
For inheritance, it's the worst place.
It's the worst place.
Just buy life insurance.
Yeah. So to hoard wealth in that account to then pass on to the next generation, man, did you get that wrong?
Well, that's why my comedy special is called The American Ream. Because American Dream is we're going to get to this great place in the future and live a great life. But it's a ream. They get there and interest rates, taxes, inflation, they become these culprits that really can rob their peace of mind and their joy. And it's pretty frustrating. And so all this planning going into the accumulation phase with no consideration for the distribution phase. So diversification isn't just about how you preserve your assets. Diversification is how you look at how you take your income.
Correct. Right.
Taxable accounts, non-taxable accounts, and even having tax strategy in retirement.
Yeah.
I mean, for those people that are this will be kind of a high level strategy, but just an idea. For me, I think that I'll eventually sell pieces of businesses I own, or even potentially some of the real estate that I own. I don't have a lot of real estate anymore. I might, I might sell a highly appreciated capital gain asset, but I might do it through a charity, right? Get a tax deduction, and then use that against income for several years.
Yep.
And then use my death benefit to replenish that charitable strategy. So it allows me to spend maybe 20, 30% more per year. But then when I die, replenish what I spent so that there's still a banking system that my heirs could tap into and pay interest to. And then they have insurance policy and they could replenish that. And if someone has a retirement plan, if you have a highly appreciated capital gain asset, a stock, a piece of real estate, a business, you might have a strategy that can offset some of the taxes you've been deferring and delaying.
Yeah. Well, when I look at the way people save or accumulate assets, the words diversification and asset allocation have a connotation of inside of a portfolio, inside of your investment portfolio or this one account. How are you diversified, or how are you allocated?
Right. If you're in a bunch of mutual funds, you're not very diversified. It's all stocks and maybe some bonds.
So I think of it more macro, and I call it the art of asset allocation, and it's an acronym.
Is that the name of your second book?
Maybe, who knows? But it's an acronym, and the first one is access. Do you have access to assets at any time? So it's okay. I'm not saying a 401k is bad, but if it's tied up till 59 and a half and you have opportunities or emergencies along the way, you can't really access it without a big penalty, and those penalties kind of negate all of the upside. So access is a big one. Do you have different buckets of money where you can touch them whenever? So if you have one you can tap whenever, then it's okay to tie some of that up. The second one is risk. Do you have an asset that always goes up in value? The only question is how fast. If you have that asset, you can then weather the storms and weather the risks. And when 2008 happens, or when the early 2000s happen, or when the next crash does happen, it will come. When that comes, you're not taking your minus 30% loss and turning it into a minus 40 or 50 because you took additional funds out of there.
And depleting that and starting to accelerate that.
You make it impossible to
disinvestment.
catch up. You make it impossible to catch up. So I think that's the risk one. And then the other one is tax. We don't know where tax rates will be. Right now, tax rates are legislated just in 2 years or a year and a half to go up to rates that they were, prior to 2018. Congress has the 100% power to change that and make that whatever they want. And if you look through historical tax rates, they've been massively higher. So if at some point the political will decides that, well, these people are too rich, and they decide what that level is, and it's probably less than you're thinking, they can tax you at whatever rate they want. So if you have these accounts, you're in debt to the IRS. You've deferred taxation on these dollars, and you will repay that debt to the IRS somewhere down the road, and you don't know the rate at which you're paying. So again, diversification and tax deferral is not a bad thing, but if you force yourself into a situation to liquidate those assets at someone else's predetermined rate, it probably makes more sense to have a vehicle in your portfolio where you can manage that. And maybe only take half as much because that's a tough tax year or whatever.
Yeah, when I wrote Killing Sacred Cows, I put out 15 issues with 401ks. And 401k is synonymous with traditional IRA or SEP IRA or any of that kind of stuff. But it was, one, we don't know what the tax rates are going to be in the future, so you're deferring into an unknown future. Two, limited to no cash flow because it's all based upon accumulation. And you'd have to take a 72T distribution to probably get cash flow before 59 and a half, which is really restrictive and not necessarily the best idea for most people. Three, FBO is the thing that bothered me for benefit of.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, cool. So this is my account or is it the government's tax code for my benefit? And how easy is it for them to make that change?
Yeah.
Right. Then I was like, it's typically overly, it's not diversified. It's usually just a bunch of stocks inside of a mutual fund, inside of whatever brokerage that people are getting.
Right.
They're putting money in whether they're making money or not. So they're getting into dollar cost averaging, which makes them average instead of thinking more strategically. I mean, there was just point after point. But my biggest issue was what happens when you finally get to the point where you're supposed to start utilizing this money? If you hated paying taxes before, you're going to hate paying them just as much. So that's a problem because it was delayed. If you take more than interest in any given year, you risk depleting the account and what's your backstop on that. And if you want to live the same lifestyle, you have to start taking more money because inflation is going to start eating away at that. And if you're one-dimensional, where you just have a house and the house isn't providing cash flow, that's a problem. So having a portfolio where you have permission to spend using the title of your book to say, well, even if you do take principal and interest, what are your backstops? What are some things that you could do by having this other asset allocation that opens up possibility?
Yeah. So the research that I did, was actually saying, okay, this buffer strategy, this volatility buffer strategy, how can we stay invested in retirement, actually have these investments work for us as opposed to several years before retirement, taking all the risk off the table and turning it into cash and thereby negating any upside going forward. How do we manage that? So it actually looked at, what if we had a buffer asset? So over like 30-year periods of time, which is what that original study was, that's where that 4% rule came from, over rolling 30-year periods of time. What did it actually do to safe withdrawal rates if we could take a year off? And that money can come from anywhere. It can come from your rich Uncle Steve. It can come from money buried in the backyard. I don't care where it comes from. Whole life, all these things. Home equity actually is a good one. If you can take a year off in a down market, so when 2022 happens and everything's down, if you can take that year off and pull money from somewhere else that's guaranteed to go up, what does that do to your safe withdrawal rate and the rest of your assets? And long story short, it came down to basically for every year of income you have that you can take from somewhere else, you can increase your safe withdrawal rate by about 0.5% or roughly 10%. So if you're taking 5% off of your portfolio, 5.5 is your new safe withdrawal rate. If you have 1 year, you can pull from somewhere else. If you have 3 years, now it's 6.5. Now we're actually starting to impact lifestyle. We're actually changing someone's lifestyle. And it's simply just
on $1 million, we're talking about $15,000 a year more after 3 years.
And the key is it's not more money. It's not that, I have more money somewhere else. It's literally just
a volatility buffer.
It's an asset shift. So in my example, if you have a 100% portfolio, but we turn it into an 85% portfolio, and that 15% is now living somewhere else on our balance sheet that can't go down, it's accessible, and it's not correlated to the markets, that will increase the safe withdrawal rate off that 85% that's still invested. And that's the strategy. It's not more complicated than that. People try to overthink this stuff. You had mentioned in one of our previous recordings that you suggest, or you personally put a certain percentage of your income into cash value participating whole life insurance.
Yep.
I do too. And early on in my career, I remember one of my early mentors said, I tell all my clients to put 5 to 10% of their income into whole life. And that was probably a good idea, but I never understood why. Like, why that number? Why not 7%? Why not 12? And I wanted to get at where that came from. And I think about it differently. I actually think about if we are doing some, projections of our accounts going forward, what percentage of my overall portfolio, my overall human allocation toward financial vehicles do I have in a non-correlated, guaranteed to go up in value asset like whole life insurance, which is my preferred. And I think if you're targeting, 15 to 20%, that's probably 3 to 4 years you can take off from a major market downturn, and we've never seen more than that historically. So that's probably a good place to start. And you can just do some backwards math on how much of a contribution you need to make to get there. And if you're more conservative, or you're more charitably inclined, or you've done well and you will be passing significant wealth to the next generation, it can be a much higher number.
Right. I mean, what it opens up when you have a death benefit, because even if you had just 3 assets instead of 2, so instead of just a retirement plan and a home, you had a retirement plan, cash value with a death benefit and a home. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, if you started spending more of that retirement plan, and then you live an extra 10 years, 15 years, you could always take a reverse mortgage on the home because you have this death benefit that could replenish that.
Exactly. You just won the lottery.
Right.
But guess what? You don't actually get paid out for 20 years. In 20 years' time, we're going to drop a $10 million check in your family's lap.
You can live a different 20 years because you know that money's coming in.
That's the key. It's not necessarily that it makes you more wealthy to have this, but that allocation makes you free to spend. You don't lose the sleep at night. You know that the backstop is in place.
There's an effect to that.
And that's what retirement plans today for most Americans don't have. All they have is an accumulation strategy. There's no decumulation strategy.
So what's your backstop? How do you prevent disinvesting where you start watching those accounts deplete and become problematic because of volatility? Where can you have an income smoothing process, a volatility buffer? Where can you make a different asset allocation decision? Maybe instead of just having money in bonds as part of that diversified portfolio, it's cash value. You still have the other part of your portfolio, but now you have a death benefit that comes along with it and a guaranteed amount every time dividends are paid. And, you did studies in 30-year periods, cash value always outperform bonds. In 10-year periods, bonds always outperform cash value because of the cost up front. So it depends on how long-term you're looking, but start thinking about taking care of yourself and giving you the gift of having volatility buffers, of giving you the gift of being able to handle market fluctuations and economies you don't control, and interest rate fluctuations and tax fluctuations and inflation coming in. Having the ability to spend more money makes a huge difference. Having the ability to access money along the way, it makes a huge difference. Having money that's safe from the market so that when the market's down, you can capitalize on opportunities makes all the difference.